On this episode of Death Row Stories,
A man accused of beating a 4-year-old girl to death and stuffing her body inside a TV box.
an unthinkable crime
If this doesn't fit the death penalty, nothing does.
lands the victim's neighbor on death row.
This nightmare is finally over.
But when a secret deal is discovered
Don't put your nose where it doesn't belong.
and a confession is called into question,
They went after the guy who was vulnerable.
an execution date is set.
They're gonna kill this guy, and he's innocent.
There's a body in the water.
He was butchered and murdered.
Many people proclaim their innocence.
In this case, there are a number of things that stink.
This man is remorseless.
He needs to pay for it with his life.
The electric chair flashed in front of my eyes.
Get a conviction at all costs. Let the truth fall where it may.
I know that 85 or 90% of this country want to move on from peace to social justice at home so that we finally end the terrible pockmarks that have made America recite a Pledge of Allegiance to her flag for 2 centuries with footnotes saying that this is what we wish we were instead of what we are.
My father, Al Lowenstein, was a political activist. He worked in the civil rights movement in the South. Dad was 7th on Nixon's enemies list, so we had the FBI coming by and people picketing our house. They called him the Viet Congressman. It was a very active childhood. I was 10, and Dad was working on Ted Kennedy's presidential campaign, and he was heading to New Hampshire. I had my bag packed. I was like, I'm coming with you. He said, did you ask your mother? I said, no. He dropped me off in Boston from that trip, and that was the last time I saw him.
Former Congressman Allard Lowenstein was shot 5 times and critically wounded today in his law office in New York City.
On March 14, 1980, Allard Lowenstein was killed by a former civil rights activist named Dennis Sweeney.
The guy went into my father's office, closed the door, and he stood over my father and shot him 5 times. And then he walked out, put the gun in an out basket on the secretary's desk and sat down and lit a cigarette and waited for the police to come.
Because of his mental illness, Sweeney never faced trial. After 20 years, he walked away from a mental facility a free man.
They were just letting him out, and there was nothing, nothing anyone could do to stop it. When I was 10, 12, 14, 16, I wanted to kill the guy myself. What it felt like to me was, if someone kills your father and walks away from it and you don't kill them, then you don't exist. A human being doesn't allow that to happen to their father. There was a part where I was planning it and asked a friend of mine if he could get me a gun that couldn't be traced. I was probably 24 or 25 where I'd realized that I wasn't going to do it and had to accept that.
In 2001, Tom refocused his anger and started writing a book about the death penalty. Tom set out to find a case where the killer was brought to justice and the victim's family given closure.
There's 3,000 people on death row in this country, and most of them did it. I wanted to find cases where someone had been caught and tried and convicted and was going to be executed. When the system works, what's it like for everybody involved?
Tom wrote to inmates across the country and got a letter back from a man named Walter Ogrod, who'd been on Pennsylvania's death row for 5 years.
The letter didn't say what the crime was, but when I looked it up and found what he did, I felt completely sick to my stomach. It was terrible.
On July 12, 1988, in a working-class Northeast Philadelphia neighborhood, John Fahey sent his 4-year-old stepdaughter, Barbara Jean, outside to play.
He said she was in an amp, and I was busy. And I just called for her, figuring she was like right there somewhere. Go up to the front, and I looked, and her toys were on the sidewalk. And she never walked away from her toys. Ever.
I was at work, and John had called for me to come home, and I'm like, what do you mean you can't find her? He says, Sharon, just come home.
Soon after, police received a 911 call from one of the Fahey's neighbors.
We got a call that there was a TV box up on St. Vincent Street. When I got there, the box was still on the sidewalk. I look in the box. The child was in a fetal position, and she was naked. She didn't have any clothes on. She looked like she was clean, like wet. She had her wet hair, wounds to her head, and there was a trash bag draping her. We knew deep down that that's probably the missing girl, and that was Barbara Jean.
She had been killed by blows to the head. She had a couple of bruises on her back. She was wet in the box, which made them feel that someone had washed her to destroy evidence. It was just horrifying. The notion that your child could be out in front of your house playing and then just gone.
4 eyewitnesses had seen a man carrying the TV box, and police posted a composite sketch throughout Northeast Philadelphia.
We had hundreds and hundreds of tips. We worked a lot of hours on it.
A $10,000 reward is being offered for information leading to the arrest of Barbara Jean Horn's murder. If you've seen the suspect or have any information...
But after countless tips and false leads, the case went cold.
You always want to do the best for her and her family and resolve it as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, we didn't.
4 years would pass before Barbara Jean's case was reopened by a special investigations unit, led by veteran detective Marty Devlin.
Detective Devlin is this big, hotshot Philadelphia homicide detective. He's the hardest working guy. He never lets a case go.
Devlin and his partner began re-interviewing the Fahey's neighbors, including a 27-year-old truck driver named Walter Ogrod, who lived across the street.
According to Detective Devlin, they start questioning him, and at that point he bursts into tears. For the next 2 hours and 45 minutes, he confesses this entire thing, and it comes out to be a 16-page confession.
They called and they said that they arrested somebody for the murder. And I said, who was it? And they said, Walter Ogrod.
What's that? Now at least we have somebody to hate. Put a face to the hate.
It was just the best news I could have ever heard, that they found her killer.
Walter Ogrod would face the death penalty.
As long as he's not given the opportunity to hurt another child and due to what he did to our family, to another family, I really don't care what happens to Walter Ogrod.
But Tom would soon discover that despite Walter's confession, Walter's jury had been convinced of his innocence.
When you start looking into it, it gets very difficult to work out how Walter Ogrod could have done this.
Police escorted John Fahey, the victim's father, out of the courtroom in handcuffs.
I think the guy might be innocent.
In 2001, Tom Lowenstein was writing a book about the death penalty when he began communicating with convicted child murderer Walter Ogrod.
Had nothing to do with this. Positively, absolutely 100% nothing. I'm 100% innocent on this.
Walter told me early on that he was innocent, but I was intent on figuring the thing out for myself.
Tom learned that in 1993, Philadelphia prosecutors had failed in their first attempt to convict Walter.
At City Hall today, the trial of a man accused of beating a 4-year-old girl to death and stuffing her body inside a TV box.
He let that poor little baby just lie there and die and then put her out in the trash. If that's not intent to kill, maybe I haven't seen it yet.
Early in the trial, prosecutor Joseph Casey presented the 16-page confession that Walter had given to Detective Marty Devlin. The confession said when Barbara Jean came to his door looking for her friend, Walter took her to the basement and tried to force oral sex on her. When she screamed, Walter killed her with a pull-down bar from his weight set.
It's a spur-of-the-moment crime based on a desire to sexually abuse a child that goes terribly wrong, and that's why he ends up killing her.
While no physical evidence tied Barbara Jean to Walter's basement, prosecutor Casey presented the box she was found in and a replica of the pull-down bar.
And the problem is the autopsy said that the murder weapon was probably flat, like a 2x4. So how could this pull-down bar possibly be the murder weapon? I just found the whole thing a little bit fishy.
On the last day of trial, Ogrod made an unusual choice and took the stand, saying that Detective Devlin and his partner had coerced him into a false confession.
Today on the witness stand, Ogrod testified, "Sir, I did not kill Barbara Jean Horn. As they told me what they believe happened. They kept putting pictures of a dead child in my face. After a while, I was starting to believe them."
There's no evidence to connect this guy to this crime that occurred
5 years ago except for this confession, and the confession is bogus.
The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict.
The jury has come back. The slip gets handed up to the judge. The judge says, have you reached a verdict? Yes, we have. And at that moment, one juror stands up and says, I'm not sure how I feel about this.
Juror Albert Sweezak stood up saying he did not agree with that verdict.
And there's just chaos in the courtroom and people screaming and yelling.
The judge immediately declared a mistrial, and seconds later, the stepfather, John Fahey, leaped out of his chair toward Ogrod.
And John just thought, this is my chance, and he bolts out of his chair.
I rushed him. The sheriff's deputy was standing in my way, and I hit him and just threw him out of my way.
I was like, John, oh my God.
My grip without me killing him. The snatch his Adam's apple right out of his throat.
Fahey was rushed out by deputies.
Ogrod was whisked out of the courtroom surrounded by sheriffs.
At that moment, there's this uncertainty about what was the vote, what was the vote. Walter came within one vote of going home.
I went through it again, and I knew I was right in my conviction that he was guilty, and I was not going to let him go.
What on earth could Walter have said or done that could make a jury disbelieve a confession in a child murder? I needed to go sit and talk with him in person. I went out to Waynesburg, where Walter is. It was the first time I'd ever been in a prison, so that was a sort of out-of-body experience. You go through all this buzzing and beeping and steel doors, and there's Walter. I looked him right in the eye and I said, Walter, did you kill Barbara Jean Horn? And he looked at me and he said, no. And what I noticed fairly quickly was he was very concrete about things. I asked him, what's it like being on death row?
Let's see, get up at 6, wait till breakfast comes around 6:30. They come to your door, open the tray slot, give you the tray, give about half an hour, come back, take it. Lunch comes, that's around 10 o'clock. They take the trays around 10:30.
I'm trying to get this person to relate his life to me, and he just can't in the way that you or I would. If you asked Walter what it was like for him when his parents got divorced, he couldn't really tell you much. He'd say, what do you mean, like sad?
My parents were living together until 1970, and my mother took us to live at her mother's place, 2310 Aspen Street, which is 4 blocks away. We lived at a place out in the Chalfont, not too far from her brother Paul's. Tomlinson Court Apartments at 1761 North 76, and then October 9th,
I ended up visiting him about 5 or 6 hours a day for 3 days in a row. The last day I was there, I didn't know how to say goodbye, so I put my fist against the glass. And Walter didn't notice it. He just kept talking, and then he finally looked at it and didn't know what to do with it. And by then I had to go. I remember going back to my hotel room thinking, what is it about this guy? At the time, I had a friend who worked with children on the autism spectrum, and I had interacted with some of her kids. And it struck me, that's what Walter is. He's not just weird. There's a thing going on here. The key moment of the confession, according to the detectives, is he says to them, please give me a minute. You have to understand how hard this is for me. I never meant to hurt that little girl. It is a flowing monologue of thought and process and description that Walter Ogrod is not capable of. I realized that he could not have given the confession.
Now intrigued by Walter's case, Tom set out to corroborate his observations with people who'd known Walter before his arrest.
Walter, he didn't seem like a normal teenager. He just seemed, it's hard to describe, like socially awkward, just very gullible. If we didn't have anything to do, we knew we could call Walt up and say, hey, Walt, do you want to buy us a case of beer? And he wanted to please you and, wanted friends, and he'd be like, oh, yeah, I'll do that. He's not stupid, but he has no common sense whatsoever.
After high school, Walter joined the Army, but his difficulty with social interactions soon led to a discharge. He then moved across the street from Barbara Jean.
After the murder happened, years and years went by and they never caught the guy.
Ogrod's confession to beating 4.5-year-old Barbara Jean Horn.
One day, the news came on and they flashed a picture of Walt on the screen. I was like, oh my God. I was like, Walt didn't do that. They had a 4-year-old unsolved homicide of a little girl and they needed to solve it, and they decided to blame it on the neighborhood idiot.
28-year-old Walter Ogrod is charged with sexually assaulting.
I immediately went to visit him. I said, Walt, why would you sign that confession? And he said, I asked for a lawyer, and they told me that if I wanted to call my lawyer, I'd have to wait in the holding tank. And you know what they do to child molesters down there. But if you sign this, we'll let you wait up here with us until your lawyer gets here. And then his lawyer got there and he thought he was going home. He was like, get me out of here. And his lawyer was like, well, you signed a confession of murder, you're not going anywhere. And that's what I mean by he had no common sense.
But while the jury had nearly set Walter free, Tom would learn that it had actually been a second confession that had sent Walter to death row. After visiting Walter Ogrod in prison, writer Tom Lowenstein had serious doubts about how Walter had landed on death row.
The key point about the first trial is that Walter testified. And it was from hearing Walter talk, hearing how he expressed himself, that the jury came to the belief that he couldn't have given the confession. And then you say, okay, well, what got him convicted at the second trial?
This is the second time a jury has been charged with deciding the fate of Walter Ogrod. The first trial ended in a hung jury.
In the 1990s, the Philadelphia DA's office sought the death penalty more than any other in the country. Walter's second trial was assigned to prosecutor Judy Rubino.
Judy Rubino was a legendarily tough prosecutor in Philadelphia. Someone had told me jokingly that she had her own wing on death row.
Rubino's case relied on jailhouse informant Jay Wolchansky, who said Walter had confessed to him in prison.
According to Wolchansky, the motive for the crime was that Walter wanted to marry Sharon Fahey, the little girl's mother. He's going to murder the little girl, and he's going to do it in such a way that police look at John Fahey for the crime. Sharon will be distraught, and Walter will then go over and comfort her, and she will fall in love with him, and they will be married.
Wolchansky testified that Walter had lured the girl across the street and tried to penetrate her. But this story conflicted with Walter's own confession.
Wolchansky takes what had been a simple crime of opportunity. In the first trial, young girl comes to the door, Walter sees young girl, Walter tries to molest young girl, and makes it into a premeditated, months-long stalking by Walter Ogrod.
He was not telling the police the entire truth. He was trying to make it as good for himself as he could. And when he was in the prison, he wasn't doing that. And he was sort of bragging to the inmate about what he had done, and that made the differences in the confession.
It's frightening when you have two opposing, contradictory versions, especially from a jailhouse snitch who just coincidentally happens to come out of nowhere after the first trial.
After deliberating for just 90 minutes, a jury found Walter guilty and sentenced him to death.
If one jury's stupid doesn't mean that the next one has to be.
They convicted the wrong man.
I feel he got exactly what he deserves, and I'm happy with the jury's decision.
I hope that animal is man enough to take the punishment the way it comes.
Having been through what I had gone through with my father, I had spent years hoping for a DA that was that tough. So on the one hand, I have this enormous admiration for Judy Rubino because she wins cases and she puts murderers away. At the same time, the story that the snitch tells at the trial has no relation to the confession and even less relation to the actual evidence in the case. I wasn't an investigative journalist, but I knew I was onto something and I had to keep going.
Tom found clues that Jay Wolchansky's story may have actually been invented by a fellow inmate, an infamous snitch named John Hall.
John Hall's specialty was to take murder cases for which there is no evidence and give the prosecution a conviction. There's this 1997 article in the Daily News about John Hall, who everybody calls the Monsignor because he's heard more confessions than a priest.
The article said John Hall had spoken with police about Walter. Tom wanted to know why.
Just boggled my mind is the story that Jay Wolchansky tells at Walter's second trial, the John Hall story.
Looking for answers, Tom tracked down John Hall's wife, Phyllis.
Anything that you tell me is on the record. If you say this is off the record, it's off the record.
Most of everything I'm going to give you is going to be that way because of the situation with John. He confided everything in me.
I said, do you think that John lied in his cases? And she says, oh yeah, John lied in his cases. I think he lied in about 30 cases. And so I said, well, do you think he lied in the Walter Ogrod case?
I said, yes, because I helped him. I helped him put Walter on death row. John worked on maybe 5, 6 cases at a time so that the DA would give him leniency on his sentences. The homicide detectives and the district attorney fed John the info. He would get some of the truth and he would sit in his cell and make up stories, and he was darn good at it.
Hall was facing a 50-year sentence in 1994 for assaulting an officer after a high-speed car chase. He was soon moved to the Philadelphia Detention Center, where Walter was awaiting trial.
I believe the district attorney moved him there specifically to get information from Walter, and he befriended Walter. I spent a lot of time researching. I sent John everything that pertained to Walter in the newspaper.
And then John took all of that and he formulated this story about the murder of Barbara Jean Horn.
When John Hall was asked to testify in another case for Rubino, he passed Walter's case to Jay Wolchansky, who was facing 30 years for burglary.
They were making this plan against Ogrod. John said, Jay needs to get out of here and he's in trouble. And I'm going to just give it to him like it's his case, like he got the information.
And John sat down with Jay and he gave Jay the story and he helped Jay write the letter to the DA's office. At the trial, the prosecution told the jury that neither John Hall nor Jay Wolchansky ever got a deal for anything they did.
John wrote to me and said that he got a sweet deal. I mean, John was looking at 50 years, and the Ogrod case got him off. Jay Wolchansky only got a few months.
I had no idea that a DA's office, such as in Philadelphia, could use a snitch ring, could use a guy like John Hall over and over and over again. I have the paperwork, I have Phyllis, and it's all fitting together.
Tom decided he now needed to confront the prosecutor who'd put Wolchansky on the stand, Judy Rubino.
What are you trying to do?
I'm trying to figure out what happened.
Tom Lowenstein believed he'd found evidence that Walter Ogrod's jailhouse confession had been fabricated by snitches to support ADA Judy Rubino's case.
When I went in to interview Judy Rubino, and in some ways it was a philosophical question, how far is too far to push? What are prosecutors allowed to do and not allowed to do?
If I could prove to you that John Hall fabricated that statement and gave it to Jay Wolchansky to use against Walter Ogrod, what would that mean to you?
I don't know how you could do that.
I have now documented that story was fabricated by John Hall.
No, you haven't. And unless you have something from Jay saying that none of that was told to him by Walter and that he made it all up, and he's willing to testify to the fact that he committed perjury, that's something else.
So that makes Walter innocent.
Trial.
At one point she said to me, well, I thought you were trying to write a book, not get the guy a new trial. And I said, I'm trying to find the truth of this. The notion that they're sending someone to death row based on this clearly fabricated snitch story is not okay.
Having lost his own father, Tom now felt he owed it to Barbara Jean's parents, Sharon and John Fahey, to share what he'd discovered.
My experience of losing someone to murder is you have days where it just destroys you as much as it ever did. I couldn't bear to think that I was calling them on a day where they were fine and I was making it horrible, or that I was calling them on a day where they were horrible and I was making it worse.
I mean, I can just tell you guys where I'm coming from on this.
There are things about certain aspects of the case that bother me a lot.
Yeah, it's your opinion. You know, everybody has their opinion.
Walter Ogrod is the murderer. Yeah. There's no doubt in my mind. He killed a little girl, but we don't know what she would have been. Right. We don't know what he stole from the world. Right. She could have been the doctor that cured cancer, the president of the United States, some world leader that, nobody knows.
She was just a beautiful little girl.
When I asked the Fahey's what they thought of the death penalty, John said, just give me a baseball bat in a few minutes and I'll take care of this. And that was actually one of the moments where I really connected with him because he had that anger and I felt it so many times in my own life. I left their house feeling like I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be the one bringing this stuff up again for them. I can't imagine how I would feel if anyone were in touch with the guy that killed my father. But every time I wanted to quit, I thought about Walter. And what am I going to tell him? Like, dear Walter, it was really upsetting to me to have to speak to the Fahey's. I don't think I can help you anymore. How do you tell a guy that?
After 3 years working on Walter's case, Tom published a 2-part article detailing the Snitch network used by the DA's office in Philadelphia. But in June 2005, the court set an execution date for Walter.
My first date with my future wife, I get a call from Walter that his appeals have been denied and they're going to execute him. So then you're sitting there on a first date going, boy, this is a lovely symphony, and inside I'm freaking out. Like, they're going to kill this guy. I know this stuff, but I can't get it to the right people. How do I do this?
But Tom's articles had been noticed by a high-powered law firm who signed on to Walter's case pro bono.
From what I had read, I thought it was clear that he deserved a new trial. When the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania signed a death warrant for Mr. Ogrod, he was placed in the wing for folks who are awaiting execution.
With these lawyers, when I got informed them, I called them up and they immediately went to court and filed the paperwork and all. I am just thankful I got these people.
Walter and his lawyers immediately filed a motion to stay the execution. And for the time being, Walter's life was spared. But for a lasting decision, the lawyers knew they'd need to address Walter's confession. So they turned to veteran homicide detective Jim Trainum.
Most people think, well, why would somebody confess to a crime that they didn't commit? My answer to that is, it's the way that an interrogation is done, the way that we were trained. Most of the interrogation schools out there teach the same approach, which is some form of the Reed technique. What the Reed technique does is it takes psychological manipulation and persuasion to convince the suspect that there's no doubt as to their guilt, that they're done. And the only way that they can receive any sort of help is by confessing. In looking at Walter's case, it was like, oh my God. I just threw my hands up. There was a lot of evidence of problematic interrogation tactics.
Like I testified, Devin was the one who was doing a lot of writing, a lot of questioning. They asked me, what have I heard about what happened? When I got up to go out the door, they shut the door on me, and Devin told me, you're not going anywhere because we believe you killed the girl, and you're blocking a memory, and we're going to help you remember it. Devin kept on telling me that I did. They kept on putting the pictures of the child's body in my face. They said, look what you did, Phil. Just try to remember all the blood that you did when you hit her. I kept on denying it. I didn't do it.
According to Walter, they not only fed him the story about the murder, but detectives lied to Walter.
Devin said, I wouldn't have seen you bring her right into your house. Said, you killed this girl over and over, repeatedly.
It's repetitive and it's overwhelming to be in that situation where you feel so trapped and you feel like these guys have all the cards, have all the evidence. All of that worked to manipulate him, to make him doubt his memory to the point where he felt that, well, maybe I did do something. And then when the detectives began to suggest what he did, he just picks up on it and he runs with their narrative.
I'm like barely awake at the time. They went over the statement a couple of times, kept on saying, sign it, sign it. At the time I signed it, they had me believing not killing her.
We spoke with a number of psychiatric professionals who believe Walter is particularly susceptible to wanting to please people, wanting to take direction, having a couple of detectives telling him, we think you did it this way, we think you did it that way. He would not be able to withstand that.
If Walter's confession had been coerced, then Barbara Jean's killer was still at large. And Jim Rollins would learn about numerous alternate suspects, including one who'd been convicted of raping and murdering another young girl. In analyzing Walter's confession, Jim Trainum noticed multiple instances where Walter's statements did not fit the evidence.
As a detective, I had a responsibility to, once I get a confession, go back and re-interview people, re-examine the evidence, and see if I can corroborate it. The detectives in this case just didn't do that. And there was a lot of red flags in there that they just chose to ignore.
If the crime had occurred in his basement, the basement would have been a mess. It would have been covered in blood. And there is no testimony from anybody who was in the house that there was blood anywhere.
There were like 5 people in the house. Nobody saw Walter with blood. Nobody saw anything going on. Nobody heard anything out of the ordinary.
Police also had access to numerous eyewitnesses who'd seen a man carrying the TV box the day of Barbara Jean's murder.
There was a witness in the alley, and he gave the statement to police that night. He said that a man came walking north up that alley carrying a box for a television. The box looked heavy and the guy was sweating and holding it with both arms, and his arms were straining. The guy asked him for a cigarette, rested the box on his knee, lit his cigarette, and then kept walking up the alley.
Several eyewitnesses saw the guy carrying the box. They described him as about 5'8", 160 pounds with either blonde or light brown, sandy-colored hair. And he was smoking a cigarette. Walt never smoked cigarettes. Walt is over 6 foot tall, over 200 pounds. He's overweight. He has jet black hair.
The detectives should have gone to these witnesses and see if they could make an ID of Walter, and it just wasn't done. Every single witness statement is to be compared to the forensic evidence and to other witness statements. That's how you determine reliability. If you do that in Walter's case, it crumbles. It just isn't there.
None of the eyewitnesses have said that it was Walter who was carrying that box. But we know that the Philadelphia Police Department was focused on several alternative suspects.
Shortly after the murder, 2 eyewitnesses positively identified the man with the box as the Fahey's neighbor, Ross Felice.
Police were following Ross Felice around for a number of months. Ross Felice knew he was being followed. I mean, he had joked with his lawyer that they're basically living with me. I look so much like that sketch.
And police traced the television box to another possible suspect.
The box had information on it, make, model, serial number. So eventually it was identified as a family on that same block as Barbara Jean that purchased that television.
The family's youngest son, college student Wesley Ward, was home alone the day of the murder.
We were in there for almost an entire day. We had pieces of carpet taken up, pieces of wall removed. We had plumbers come in and go to the traps and clean traps out. And we just thought that was it, but it wasn't.
While both Ward and Felice faced grand juries, neither would be indicted. But police had leads on yet another suspect.
In 1987, a young girl named Heather Coffin was sexually assaulted and murdered by a guy named Raymond Sheehan, about a mile from Barbara Jean. And the main witness in the Barbara Jean murder identified Raymond Sheehan as the man he saw carrying the box. Positive identification. You have a positive ID of someone who murdered another little girl, and you know it. As far as I know, the DA has done nothing.
We believe there is additional material that we have not seen regarding the original investigation by the homicide unit. The police department and the DA have taken positions consistently that they believe that certain information need not be produced. My understanding is that is not uncommon in Philadelphia.
Rollins has argued for DNA testing on fingernail scrapings from Barbara Jean and samples from inside the box she was found in to reveal her killer's true identity.
The truth about what happened to that little girl is very possibly in the evidence vault right now in Philadelphia, and the DA's office is fighting against testing it. Are they interested in finding out who actually killed Barbara Jean Horn?
By 2011, Walter had been on death row for 15 years, and attorney Jim Rollins and his team filed an extensive argument to the Pennsylvania courts for a new trial.
We spent years reinvestigating Walter's case, literally thousands of hours, and we have before the court our full briefed Post-Conviction Relief Act petition seeking a complete new trial on numerous grounds. Federal constitutional grounds, state procedural grounds, but in the meantime, Walter, who we believe is innocent, remains on death row.
The Philadelphia District Attorney asked the court to dismiss the entirety of Rollins' petition and objected to full DNA testing.
There are fingernail scrapings, there's biological material from the box in which the victim was found, fingerprint evidence. We can't test it unless the court gives us an order allowing us to do it.
If you're a prosecutor with any integrity, you would say, all right, we'll pull all the DNA out and test it. Let's just be sure. And they won't do it. And they won't do it because they don't want to know if they made a mistake. Even the Fahey's told me at the time that they were for DNA testing.
If there were a DNA to be tested, that could be tested against Ogrod, would you still
Sure. That would be fine to me. Now, would he be willing?
Oh, he insists on it.
Oh, does he?
Oh, absolutely demands it.
Yeah. I mean, let's put it this way, okay? If for some reason he is not the person who killed Barbara Jean, well, then I wouldn't want to see him killed.
When we took this case on 11 and a half years ago, I don't think we expected to be sitting here today waiting for a decision on just a discovery motion, seeking access to testing materials that should be tested.
Rollins' petition includes a 2005 affidavit from Jailhouse snitch John Hall, admitting he gave Walter's story to Jay Walchansky. The DA's office has argued that regardless of Hall's statement, they still have Walter's original confession.
Judy Rubino told the jury at the second trial that the confession was a lie. So how they can now come back, trial A is confession. Trial B is confession was a lie, snitch is true. Appeals are snitch doesn't matter, confession was true. And somehow in all of that, they're saying Walter said all of this. Well, Walter didn't say any of it.
We probably interrogate thousands of people, who knows, millions of people a year. The fact that these techniques that we use every single day have the possibility of getting inaccurate information and putting a man on death row and killing an innocent person, that's enough reason to look at other ways, better ways of doing this.
This is our system. This isn't somebody else's responsibility. This is everybody's responsibility. You shouldn't be forgetting that somebody sitting in a prison somewhere is not your problem, because everybody sitting in prison everywhere is everybody's problem for a whole host of reasons, especially when we've got them lined up to be killed.
In my opinion, the death penalty is 100% about revenge, which is a perfectly valid emotion. Some people do such horrible things that, you know, to me, do they deserve to die? Sure. Just not something I think the state should be in the business of, because we become killers. And I think there's a real value in not becoming killers. All the pain that I went through brought me to this point where I wanted to do this book about how the system works. And I stumbled upon a case that taught me very clearly how badly it doesn't work sometimes and how intentionally not working it is. because the truth is there, and there's a willfulness in not hearing it on the side of the people in power. When I stop and think of Walter Ogrod sitting on death row for all these years, it's a very hard thing to take.
I'm hoping there'll be something what they're holding back testing. But at times, I just worried about getting screwed worse by the court system and all, that they just don't care. They just want to put someone away. They want to admit we screwed up bad. I mean, this has happened before to people all over the place. I feel I'm going to end up like them.
Walter was locked up when he was 26 years old. I mean, he's 51 now. His hair's starting to get gray. They took his whole life away from him. I would think that the Philadelphia police and the Philadelphia DA would want the person who really killed this little girl in jail. So do it. Find the person who killed her and let Walt have the little bit of life left that he has to live.